If you've just watched my video on what Azure Bastion is, or maybe you're just curious how to set it up, well, this is the video for you. I'll show you how to do it the super simple way, how to set it up in a hub and spoke environment, how to use it across clouds or to your on-prem, and how to set it up with Bicep, and even how to use the native client with Azure Bastion. So watch this. This is something I recorded during one of my live streams over at Twitch. Link is down in the description. Do follow me there if you want to catch these kinds of things live. In the simplest scenario, we will basically have one virtual network. And in that virtual network, we have a virtual machine. That's about it. And then we will throw Azure Bastion in there. Let's go to the portal and see how we do that. Let's start by creating a new resource group. Call this Fun with Bastion. Simple. And Norway East. There we are. Create that. Then within our Fun with Bastion simple, let's create a virtual network. Okay, so we put our virtual network in our proper resource group. Let's just call this VNet. We will accept the defaults here, hit create, and once that's done, there we are. Then we need to have a virtual machine here as well. So let's create a virtual machine, put it in the same resource group, just call it VM1, and let's do a Windows-based one, and we will allow no inbound ports, because that's a bad thing. Networking is in the VNet that we just created. We will not have a public IP. We'll skip NSDs for now. That's about it. So let's go review and create. And then we wait. It's done. All right, so basically what we have now is this simple setup. So we have a virtual network and we have our Windows, but we want a way in to remote that server without assigning a public IP. So in the Azure portal, I would go to my VM and then I would hit connect, then select Bastion here. And since I don't have an Azure Bastion in this VNet, I will be asked if I want to create an Azure Bastion using the defaults or if you want to configure Azure Bastion on my own. In this case, I'll use the defaults. So I'll just hit create Azure Bastion using the defaults, and it will add the subnet required for Azure Bastion, which is the Azure Bastion subnet. And then it will create the Bastion service itself, which of course then will be placed within that Azure Bastion subnet. There we are. Now that the Bastion is created, I can just simply input my credentials here and then hit connect. And I will have a new tab open up asking if I want to allow access to the clipboard, which I want. And now I'm being logged into my VM, which has no public IP, so it's not publicly exposed to the internet. But since I have that Bastion service, I am connecting on the inside. So that's kind of cool. That's the simple scenario of using Azure Bastion. But say if we want to do the same from the Bastion side of things, but in this case, we still have our virtual network. Let's see if we can do it with a Linux VM. We'll create a virtual machine, select the right resource groups and stuff. We'll just call it VM02, use Ubuntu this time. For now, I will use password. You could also use a public key if you wanted to, even with Azure Bastion. And of course, I will allow no inbound ports, and then networking, default settings on the virtual network and subnet, but I will not need a public IP. And yeah, hit review and create, and then create my VM. All right, I have my VM. My Linux VM. Let's take a look at how to set up Azure Bastion from the Bastion side of things, I guess. So in the Azure portal, go to Bastions and hit create. Select subscription and resource group, of course. Then give it a name. So I'll just call it Bastion for simplicity's sake now. Select our region, Norway East. Select the SKU. I'll use the basic for now. And then selecting the virtual network. And I'll select my VNet here. And get the error message that to associate a virtual network with Bastion, it must contain a subnet with the name Azure Bastion subnet and a prefix of at least /24. Let's click Manage Subnet Configuration, add Azure Bastion subnet, and we know that the 10.0.1.0/26 is available, so let's create that. Now that the subnet is ready, let's go back to create a Bastion. Now it's selected our Azure Bastion subnet, which is cool. We need to create a public IP for our Bastion service, so I'll just call it Bastion for now. Then hit review and create, There we are, our deployment is complete. And since I now have my Bastion here, I can go into my resource group and I will find my VM02, which is my Linux VM. And I will click connect Bastion, it will automatically select the Bastion host that is closest to it and input my credentials. You can see that since this is a Linux VM, you can use a private key from local file, or even private key from Azure Key Vault, which is kind of cool. Yeah, I'll input my username, password, and hit connect. We'll get that new browser tab, and voila, I'm into my Linux VM. Simple way of logging into a Linux VM through Azure Bastion. So now that we've been through this simple one with just a VNet and a VM, or 2 VMs, now let's consider another scenario where we have one virtual network, and within that virtual network we already have 2 subnets, and these of course have each of their VMs. Now what do we do if we have spent all of the address space for the virtual network on these 2 subnets? Then we would have to expand the address space to accommodate the room for the Azure Bastion subnet, because we know that Azure Bastion requires its own subnet, so we will need to add that on the side here as well and make sure that we have the address space for it. So how do we do it? Well, let's go back to the Azure portal, and first of all we need to create a resource group for it. And now we have our Fun with Bastion multiple subnets. We will hit create, search for virtual network, hit create, select subscription, select resource group. We will just simply call this VNet as well. Now let's shrink down this address space for a bit. We will use 10.1.00/23. That will allow for 512 addresses, but let's add a couple of subnets. Subnet 1, this will have the 10.1.00/24, add, and then subnet 2 will have 10.1.1/24. Yeah, so this will effectively use up all the address space that we have in the VNet. Hit review and create. And once that is done, we will also deploy a couple of VMs so that we have a VM in each of the subnets. Create virtual machine. Let's call this first one VM03. Since we had those 2 from before. This will be Windows. Input credentials. Of course, no inbound ports. This will be in subnet 1 without a public IP. Hit create on that VM. And while that is deploying, let's create our second VM as well. All right, so this means that now we do have our 2 VMs and a VNet. And if we check the address space, then we see that we have 10.1.0.0/23, but our subnets are 10.1.00/24 and 10.1.1.0/24, meaning that we've used all the address space. So what happens then if we go back to our main page, go to Bastions, and then try to create a Bastion? Then select the correct subscription and the correct resource group. Call this Bastion 2. Select Norway East. We'll still use the basic one. Select correct VNet. And then you get the same error message stating that there's no Azure Bastion subnet in that VNet. But now if we click Manage Subnet Configuration and click Add to the subnet, there is no available space for us. If we try with 10.1.1/24, you will get, well, it overlaps with subnet 1. And same goes for 10.1.1. It overlaps with subnet 2. So now we would actually need to expand the address space in order to create a new subnet. So I'll hit cancel on that and then go back to address space. And I have 2 options here. You could either expand this, for example, changing to a /22, or I could add an additional range here. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'll add 10.2.0.0/24, and then I'll hit save. And now that I have the additional address space, I could go back to subnets. I'll hit add subnet, call this Azure Bastion subnet, and it will be pre-populated with the address space that I put in, but I can shrink it down. So I'll use a /26 now, because that will give you 59 addresses plus the 5 Azure reserved ones. And Azure Bastion can't scale outside of those 50 instances, so it will never need anything more than a /26. So I'll add this and hit save, and there it is. I can go back to create a Bastion. It will select the Azure Bastion subnet for me. So let's create also a new public IP address for our Bastion 2 and review and create. Cool. Our new Bastion is created. So I can go back home, go to Bastions, and I'll find my Bastion 2 and see that it's alive and well in our Azure Bastion subnet that we created. So basically now we have this here. We have added the 3rd subnet, which is the Azure Bastion subnet, meaning that I could go into my resource group and then I'll find my VM. I'll hit connect. It'll select Bastion 2, which is the one we recently deployed. Grab my credentials here, hit connect, allow clipboard access. And now I'm logging into my Windows VM. But just for good measure, let's verify that we can connect to our Linux VM as well. So back to my resource group, I will find the next VM, which is my Linux one. Hit connect, Bastion, input my credentials, and hit connect. And now I'm into my Linux VM as well. So now we have an Azure Bastion in this third subnet, which I can use to connect from the internet to both of my subnets here. Cool, huh? All right, now let's see how we can use Azure Bastion in a hub and spoke kind of thing. So let's go back to our drawing board. And in this scenario, we'll have a VNet here, which will be our hub. Then we have a VNet over here and another VNet over here. We'll have a Windows VM here and a Linux VM there. This VNet here will be peered to this one, the hub, and this one will also be peered to the hub, and then we'll just throw Azure Bastion in this main hub VNet here. Then that will connect across peerings to our Windows VM and our Linux VM. So let's go back to the Azure portal. We'll create a new resource group for this scenario. Then go into our resource group, and we will need 3 different virtual networks. So we'll start by creating our hub one. Then while that is deploying, let's go back to our resource group and create our spoke virtual network. And while that is deploying, back into our resource group, create yet another virtual network. While that is deploying, let's go back to our resource group, because I believe now we have our spoke one, so we can create a virtual machine and deploy it there. And then while that is deploying, let's create our Linux VM as well. So back into our resource group, hit create, virtual machine, create. And just for good fun, let's use a public key for authentication, and then we'll ask Azure to generate a new key pair. Name of the public key, Bastion test. And now, since we did select a key pair, when we hit create, we will be prompted to download that private key. So I'll do that. Then I have my bastion test.pem, and the deployment of our Linux VM is on its way. Now, while that is deploying, let's create the Bastion instance for this hub and spoke. Back home, Bastions, create, because now we can't use that standard way of doing it through the VM side. Like we saw earlier, if you don't have an Azure Bastion, you will be prompted to create one. We can't use that now because we were not using the defaults. We want to create the Azure Bastion instance in our hub VNet. That's why we're going this way. And now just select my subscription and my resource group. Call this, what's this, Bastion 3. Region will be Norway East. For good fun, let's use the standard this time. VNet will be VNet hub, and it will select the subnet, public IP, and then hit review and create. So while that is deploying, let's do some peering, because we need to create the peering between the spokes and the hub. Not between the spokes themselves, but between one spoke and the hub and the other spoke and the hub. So let's go back into our resource group and find our hub VNet, and then go to peerings. It's add hub to spoke one would be the peering link name. For this first one, hit allow. None is fine. On the remote would be spoke 1 to hub, and the virtual network would be VNet spoke 1. And of course, allow, and none on this. Hit add, that's a success. So let's do the same for spoke number 2. We'll hit add, and this will be hub to spoke 2. Allow, none. On the remote side will be spoke 2 to hub, and the remote virtual network in this case will be spoke 2. Allow, none, hit add. And now our hub network here is peered to virtual network 1, or in this case spoke 1 and spoke 2. Now we only need to wait for the deployment of Azure Bastion instance. And now our Azure Bastion is done. If you go back into our resource group now, we should be able to go into our VMs and hit connect and select Bastion, and it will actually select the newest of our Bastion instances, even though it's not in the same VNet. But since the VNets themselves are peered, the Azure portal will see that, oh, okay, there's some connection from that Bastion host to this VM, so we can use that. Input my credentials here and allow clipboard access. And now I'm actually remoted into my VM from the Azure Bastion host in this virtual network over peering to our Spoke VNet. Let's, for good measure, let's also test the Linux one. So back into our resource group, we'll find VM06, then connect, Bastion, username, and this time a private key from a local file, and browse for our Bastion test, and then hit connect. And voila, showing just how easy it is to connect even with a private key file. So now in this scenario, we have created an Azure Bastion host here in our hub VNet, connected to our Windows VM and to our Linux VM. Pretty simple, pretty cool. All right, now for our final scenario, we will use Azure Bastion in our Azure environment to connect to a VM in another cloud, using the Azure Bastion as a jump service to another cloud, which is kind of cool. And this other cloud could, of course, also be your on-prem environment. Let's get to the drawing board and just see what we are dealing with here. So within this Azure setup, we have a virtual network where we will place our Azure Bastion host. And we will also have a virtual network gateway, which will connect to, let's just use this shape. So over here, we have another network. So it will be kind of the same scenario there. We will have an IPsec tunnel between these two. So our Azure Bastion will live on the left side here in this virtual network. And then in this other cloud, we will have a VM and we will connect to that from our Azure Bastion. So let's see how we set up that in Azure. And I have already deployed a resource group and I have a virtual network gateway. So we will start by connecting to that other cloud connections. Hit add. This will be to other cloud. Connection type will be IPsec. We will need to create a local network gateway. Just call this LNG other cloud. IP address of our remote partner is this one. The address space on that side will be 172.16.00/16. So this is that other cloud that I was talking about. Hit OK. And the shared key will be, let's see, something really simple. And then we'll hit OK. And once this connection is created, it will try to actually connect. Okay, so now I have that connection. Now it's connected. So that means that we have our connection to the other cloud set up, which also means that we can now deploy our Azure Bastion. So I will go back to my resource group, hit create, search for Bastion and hit create, select subscription, resource group, call it Bastion to other clouds. This will be in Norway East, and this time we actually have to use the standard SKU because we can't use the basic now. The reason for it is that the basic SKU does not allow for a IP-based connection. It will only allow you to connect VMs in your Azure portal, which in this case we don't have any VMs in our portal. We only have VMs in that other cloud. We need that IP-based connection, which means that we also need to use the standard SKU. And then we'll select VNet. It will select the Azure Bastion subnet for us. We will create a public IP and then hit review and create. And create. All right, cool. Our Bastion host is ready. So I'll hit go to resource. And now I need to enable that IP-based connection. So I'll get to configuration and I'll put a check mark on IP-based connection. Hit apply and then wait some more. Hey, it's done. So let's hit refresh. And now we see that we have a connect feature here. So let's click connect. And then we know that our remote VM is 172.16.0.36. So I'll input that here. Protocol RDP port 3389. Yes. And my credentials are this. And then hit connect. So far, it's pretty much the same as the other way of connecting. So let's see if we can connect across the clouds now. And yeah, we are in. We are now connected to that host in the other cloud from the Bastion host in our Azure environment, meaning that we have connected from Bastion in one Azure cloud to another cloud, but that cloud could just as easily have been your on-prem environment. As long as there's a connection from your Azure environment to that other place where you have your VMs, you're good to go. All right, so now over to our final scenario, deploy Azure Bastion through Bicep. So I'll need to start by creating a resource group for this. And now that I have my resource group, let's go over to Visual Studio Code, where I have my Bicep code. So I'm not going to go into all of this in detail. You can find all of these on my GitHub page. There's a repository called Streamsoft. Link is down in the description, of course. But basically what this is, you have a main.bicep, which calls a bunch of other biceps. So if we take a look at design for this setup, so let's go to this page. I already have drawn this up. I have a resource group, which is the one we just created. And the goal here is to have a Bastion hub VNet, and we have a spoke 1 VNet and spoke 2 VNet. Also the same as we had with the hub and spoke example. Hub VNet, spoke VNets, peerings, and then Azure Bastion. But basically what this Bicep setup does, this main.bicep, it takes in one parameter, which is the password for the VMs. And then it calls on vnets.bicep to create a bunch of VNets. It calls upon vms.bicep to create a couple of VMs. Then it calls vnet peering.bicep to create the peerings between the hub VNet and the spoke VNets. And then it runs a bastion.bicep, which is the actual deployment of Azure Bastion. But that Bicep file we can take a look at. So if we take a look at the top here, you see that the first thing it creates is a public IP address, because you need to have a public IP address for your Azure Bastion. And then it creates an Azure Bastion. It takes in the location from the top here, which is an input to the bastion.bicep, and disable copy paste is false, and then it creates an IP configuration for it using the public IP address that it was just created, and then it specifies which subnet to be placed in, and that's about it. So if I want to deploy this now, so I'll go into the folder where this is all located, and then I'll do new.az resource group deployment, give it name fun with Bastion, and then the resource group name, which was fun with Bastion dash bicep, and the template file would be main.bicep, and hit enter. Now it will validate and then ask for the password for the VMs. I'll input that, and that should start the deployment. Now there's not going to be a whole lot of progress being shown here, but what we can do is go back to our Azure portal and then go into our resource group and check deployments. You can see that there's a whole lot of deployments going on. Our fun with Bastion is what we call our deployment, and then that creates a couple of other deployments as well. So it will take at least a few more minutes before it's complete. All right, it's done. So now our Azure Bastion setup, this setup, should be deployed. And all we really did was create a resource group and then hit enter on a single command. And we can see that we have a spoke setup with hub, VNet, and spoke 1 and spoke 2. We have our Bastion, public IPs, VMs, and if I go into one of these VMs, I can connect using Bastion, and it will select proper Bastion host, and I'll hit connect, and I'm in. So that's the Bicep way. It's pretty simple once you have the code, of course. But the neat thing about doing it with Bicep is that you can do this again and again and again quite simply. So if you're building demo environments or just learning about stuff with a limited budget, then you can just deploy it, do whatever you want, and then destroy it, and next time you come around you can deploy it again. So yeah, that was it for Azure Bastion, I think. We need to do that bonus scenario as well, don't we? So if we go back to our Fun with Azure Bastion simple and go to our Bastion here, this time we need it to be a standard one, because we are going to use native client support. So I'll just hit apply and wait for quite a few minutes. Hey, it's deployed. Cool. So now that we have our native client support, we should be able to connect two VMs through this Bastion with our native client. But we can't just fire up the RDP client. We have to initiate the connection from Azure CLI. So let's start by firing up our terminal, and we can go out AZ log in. It'll fire up a new browser window. We'll select our account. It's login successful. Go back to our terminal, then AZ account set, and then we'll find the correct subscription ID. Copy that, paste that in like so. We will need to do AZ account set -- subscription, and then we do AZ network Bastion RDP, and then name would be our Bastion host, which in this case is just Bastion, then -- resource -group, paste the resource group in there, then we have the -- target -resource-id. And here we need the resource ID for our VM. So back into the portal, we'll select our VM, scroll on down to properties, scroll way down to resource ID, hit copy the clipboard, back to the terminal, paste it in, hit enter, and it's firing up the remote desktop client. And here we hit more choices, use a different account, use the local account for that VM, and hit yes on the certificate. And it will say localhost here, but that's just because it's actually Azure CLI is doing kind of a proxy thing. So it is localhost, but if we go into local server here, you can see that this is actually VM1 in our Azure environment. And since this is your native RDP client, you can use stuff like file transfers, which is kind of cool. So that's how you connect to a VM with the native client using Azure Bastion and have no public exposure of the VM. Cool. So now that you've seen how to deploy Azure Bastion in a multitude of ways, let's put it into some designs. Go check out my series on designing Azure for scale. And yeah, thanks for watching.